Okay, let's get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Donaghy in the English department. I thank you all for coming out today to be in the audience for or participating in our program, Inscriptions for Air, celebrating the release of Jake Adam York's collection of poems, Abide. I've been looking forward to this event all semester. Looking forward is a strange way to phrase it, but looking forward in a complicated way for this event because I've been a friend of Jake's for 20 years now. In the fall, it will be 20 years that I've known Jake. And since my earliest days, I've been a fan of his character and his spirit and his poetry. And as much as I've looked forward to this day and as wonderful it is for all of you to be here and to be a part of it, there's also the huge part of me that wishes I were sitting down and we were all just listening to Jake do his thing. But in the absence of Jake's physical presence, Jake's spirit will exude throughout the room, throughout the evening. And I'd like to begin with some of Jake's words, which he provides to us in the foreword to a subsequent reading at the end of Abide, which gives an overview of the project that he has taken on throughout his four collections of poetry, which look in a concentrated way at martyrs of the civil rights movement and also touch on a number of other things deeply important to his life and to his research. But as a way of summing up his life's work, he, in writing a book and didn't quite have the project finished that he had envisioned, and spent a lot of time talking to him about this project as it expanded, as it grew, as it formed itself. And he wrestled very hard with how to get these subjects down on paper and how to pay homage in a way that was respectful and appropriate and true to himself and true to art and keeping in a tradition of others who've tried to do such work previously. Well, really what he ultimately arrived at, and that's what, when we have the Abide in our hands, you have the manifestation of, I think, a clarity of vision that is truly remarkable in American poetry. As if you had read all of the books as I have, you see in Abide a graduation, the continuation of elegizing civil rights martyrs and looking more closely at a personal history, his family history, his relationship with the South, with a number of other subjects. We'll get rid of that in a second. And anyway, so you're not just looking at four books, you're really looking at four books that speak to each other, and they're part of a book that Jake had envisioned that he was still writing. And anyone who's ever spent time talking to Jake knows it's best just to let Jake say it. So I'm going to let Jake say it. And he says it like this as he conceptualizes the project. One of the books, Abide is a book made of two books. I'm going to wake this up. Hang on a second. Can we edit this up? There we go. Abide is a book made of two books, each written over and within the other. One of these books advances the project I've been developing for almost a decade now. In my books, Murder Ballads, A Murmuration of Starlings, and Persons Unknown, to elegize each of the martyrs in the civil rights movement. When the Civil Rights Memorial was erected in Montgomery, Alabama in 1989, its marble table included the names of 40 men, women, and children who were martyred between 1954 and 1968 as part of the freedom struggle. Over the past 2 decades, forgotten cases have come back into the light, writing more darkly the faint names in the company of martyrs. With each recounting, my project has expanded. It was always too big for one book. It was more complicated than a simple serial form, like a trilogy. It was the work of a life, both countless and one. One cannot predict how long it will take, but it will take as long as it has to take, as long as it will take. Abide continues and advances even as it contains, as it remains. Now, to elegize the martyrs of the movement requires delicacy, requires reflection. For a white man, to elegize the men, women, and children murdered by men whom I resembled, demographically, by men to whom I may be related, or for whom I may be mistaken, for this man, to elegize the martyrs requires a hesitation, a stutter, a silence in which the ghosts of the murderers may be sloughed from my skin, even if only for a moment. In these moments of hesitation, these poems consider or enact the consideration of the necessary ethical questions. What does it mean to elegize? What does it mean to elegize martyrs? What does it mean to disturb the symmetries of the South's racial policies, of the South's racial poetics? The project I'm referring to is Inscriptions for Air, which includes much of the work of the previous volumes and requires the work of several volumes to come. Inscriptions for Air, then, is a book without a single spine, without a single binding. My hope is that the presence of a larger body of work asks only the questions of memory, not only questions of memory, but questions of life that will suggest the necessary continuity and perpetuity of the work of memory. We visit sites like the Civil Rights Memorial. But if memory lives only there, it isn't memory anymore. That is to say, if we go, we look at names, we feel sorry those names are there, and then we go home, it isn't memory anymore. We've constituted an instrument of forgetfulness, really, right? Memory doesn't live in a place on a wall, in a monument. And edit Dan's words, here are Jake's words. Memory lives in the breath we breathe, in the air we make together. Memory is a living thing. Memory is not a recognition of death. It's an acknowledgement of life. And that's very much what we are here to do today, in recognizing, we are certainly acknowledging the passing of Jake Adam York, but we are celebrating the existence of his poems, which will never die. A few final things. Jake, as he mentioned himself, is the author of 4 collections of poetry: Murder Ballads, A Murmuration of Starlings, Persons Unknown and Now Abide. He also published a book of literary history, The Architecture of Address, The Monument of Public Speech in American Poetry, and he's recipient of this year's Walter Beiner Fellowship, which is awarded by the Poet Laureate of the United States, who is currently Natasha Trethewey, who a couple of years ago stood and gave a reading in this exact spot. Symmetry is a funny thing. She says this about Jake's work. In his body of work, poems of sheer beauty, grace, precision of image, and technical skill, we find a profound intervention in our ongoing conversations about race and social justice, a bold and necessary challenge to our social amnesia. Jake Adam York is one of our most indispensable American poets, and the presence of his work in the world, his vision, his enduring spirit is for me and for all of us a guiding light. Another contemporary poet, Brian Spears, said this in his review in The Rumpus. There's a reason why antebellum mansions still serve not as museums dealing with the ugliness of slavery, but as popular backdrops for wedding receptions, the kind celebrated by Paula Deen, recreating the glory of Gone with the Wind and everything it has to do with, which is an unwillingness to deal with the past openly and honestly. York's poetry is important because of the way it attacks that unresolved history and refuses to let the long-standing narrative go unchallenged. And it does so from a position of power that makes it difficult for the privileged to ignore it, the way it does the work of similar work by poets of color who may share the same thematic spaces. Jake York was a champion, the review goes on to say, and it's a damn shame that this is his final book, given the promise of his life's work. Before we begin, I'd like to just call attention to the program and thank in advance the faculty and staff, and especially my students who have volunteered to be a part of this event. And thanks to my wife, Karen. I saw Karen and Abigail who are up there. both of whom knew Jake and will be participating in the reading as well. We're going to begin, as you see in your program, with a couple of poems from Jake, who was here in 2008. You get a sense of who he is. You will like him. That's my prediction. After that, we will follow the order of programs as they appear on the program. And if you are presenting, I just ask that each reader remain at the podium after you finish your poem and then introduce the next person on the list. Okay? So without further ado, let's get started and listen to Jake read a couple of poems.
And welcoming to Eastern, Dr. Jake Adam York.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone who's here tonight. And thanks again to all the people Dan thanked for writing the checks and supporting this sort of event. It's really a great pleasure to see a room so filled with people who are ready to listen. So I hope I don't squander your generosity here. The first poem I'm going to read is called From a Field Guide to Etowah County, and I think it tells you everything you'll need to know. Bluets, larkspur, common violets in the Jimson and Queen Anne's lace, tangles of boxwood and honeysuckle and smilax, and hydrangea and pine, a thick from which spring azures drift, among the first to emerge. Then swallowtail's gunmetal iridescence, obsidian with stars' wings, turning like pages in hands of wind. Thrashers tear in the leaves for earthworms, salamanders, some morsel, their stipple of sunlight and leaves blending, then reappearing in a crash of meal. If a snake uncurls, the bird will leaf it in Bibles of territory and protection, and someone's aunt or grandmother passing will pause to note that summer is on us early. But this one merely stands, its wing an array, feathers a concrete model of grain and pebble, like a roadside table turned into brush long ago. Here there is no split persimmon or cankered plum, no sap or juice to bead mimeograph bright on the grass's nibs. And the grass does not whirl in cursives of moonlight and dark each night. But this is where they found that postman from Baltimore, walking his integration letter to Ross Barnett, 300 miles to go, shot in his head and neck, copies of the protest scattered and streaking in the April dew. It was September, honeysuckle in full perfume, the woods a riot of grackles and jays when the grand jury broke and let the suspect go. The facts are simple, my grandfather said. The DA said we couldn't make a case, so the words they never wrote coiled into field reports and requisitions, and 3 days later a church bomb in Birmingham blew the stained glass face of Christ like a dandelion head in the roadside weeds. Snake root, aster, and blazing star, some toxic to cows, should not be eaten, though many take the greens and fruit of poke, more abundant in spring, as correctives, small poisons to set things right. Goldenrod blazes the highway shoulders all the way to Birmingham or Chattanooga, and starlings gather like glass, like grackles in the trees, such sociability in advance of colder weather. The swallowtails and azures have disappeared, but you may spot the great purple hair streak, bumbling, slow and easy to observe, even in the clouds of goldenrod that dust when they land. The cones are brilliant, but delicate as their gossamer wings, touch, and the colors written in your skin. Now, as Alexa noted, much of the project of my poetry is a kind of recovery, if you will. The civil rights movement is punctuated according to some accounts, by the murders or the violent beatings of, in particular, 41 people whose suffering is remembered on the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And as I was saying in the University Hour earlier today, from the very first time I visited there, I've been struck by the fact that there's an overwhelming feeling that you should know who these people were and what their lives were like before these moments of suffering, and that you should know the facts of this suffering, but also a sad realization that in many cases the silence that surrounded that suffering simply continues today. And so a lot of these poems seek to reach back into those particular moments, those horrific moments, and to look at the facts of those moments so they don't, they're not left to silence, basically. So I'm reading two poems with the same title. These are both called At Liberty. In the town of Liberty, Mississippi, in 1961, a man named Herbert Lee was murdered by a state congressman in broad daylight, and he just walked away. Manufactured witnesses who later recanted their stories, and one of the witnesses who wouldn't play along was murdered 3 years later on the night before he was supposed to leave town for good. So, At Liberty, 1961. Everyone will say he drove to the gin with a truck full of cotton. So he drives to the gin and gets in line. And everyone will say the congressman pulled in behind him. So he gets out yelling, "Herbert Lee, I'm not messing with you this time." And his affidavit will say, Lee had a tire iron. And there are no photographs, so there is a tire iron. And since the congressman will say Lee swung at him, his hand will grasp the iron under the tangle of his own dead weight. And the congressman will leave and will not see him again, so he just lies there bleeding for a time, and no one will touch him. So he is just a story, or a huddle of starlings, or crows, or a cloud of bottleflies that might explode and disappear, until the witnesses can say he's there, and an undertaker can come with a hearse from the next county over, and then he is dead, and the congressman can tell his story. So Herbert Lee will rise from his coffin and swing his iron, and the FBI will come to make him into evidence. But someone will have roped him into his grave already, so there is no photograph, and no one sees the cotton bowl wicking blood, so there is no bowl, only a clear white negative in the dark and a paper that slowly fills with flies. At Liberty, 1964. This is for a man named Lewis Allen. The morning train is turning like a compass needle. Now the night has folded all its schedules into the stands of pine and cedar, all its innumerable wings. And tomorrow he will be gone from the lumber yards and the farmhouse windows that semaphore like televisions, in the vacant hands of Herbert Lee and the killer, and the quiet of having never seen a thing. Quietly now, while the truck is idling, dark decides from all the county's limbs, shattering into birds that shatter, then collapse to his skin. Beaks lace eardrum and eardrum, his cheeks, his tongue, their obsidians needling for what he's seen, what he would surely tell, so he won't have to see it, so he won't have to whisper it even once, ever again.
Okay. That. Okay. Now all we have to do is get that to go off. Continue with the festivities. Yes, I'm sure I'd like to shut it down. Okay. There are just a couple of Jake's poems. If you'd like to see more of that reading, the rest of it is available through the Media Services website, so please check it out. Okay, next we're going to get to the poems from Abide, beginning with Abide With Me by read by Karen Donaghy.
Abide with me. Fast falls the light, through the trees, the windows, through valances and dust. Its fingers thin, its fingers flatten and blush. One hand on the cover, one on my breath, you ease me to the hour when the clock forgets its hands. A dream of a lake I'd swim years before we meet, and the boathouse where I'd lie inches from the water, drying in the afternoon. You shake the light from your shoulders. It falls to the floor, to the water where I swam when the lake was my clock, my dream, no hour, no hands but yours, if they dream us here. The stereo takes back our breath. All sound is light. Your fingers pulling back the dust, the curtains. Pull back the curtains, pull back the day, so we can fall breathless into night. Next is Zachary Marotte.
This one is called Te lyra, pulsa, manu, or something like that. As Ovid or an Onomacritus, or was it Ike Turner, said, music makes everything want to reach out of itself. Rocks forgetting their gravity, birds hovering as if become part of the air itself, until the pines and the olives leaning over Orpheus as he slid the bottle along the guitar's neck, gave up their sap and oil, which is why he glistened in the sun or the starlight and seemed to express that brilliance, like a zoetrope or a planetarium, and you couldn't tell if he was gathering or giving it back. But that's music, erupting beautiful and returning to itself at last. Mercury's gift, the turtle's gut strung across its desiccated shell. A melody pulled from such concentrated silence and returned to its bowl, making every ear the parentheses that separates us from persistence. But we want to last, at least long enough to grasp what we've just let go. So the women, washing their clothes by the river, hearing that song, its melody remembering, then forgetting everyone they knew, left their clothes to froth on the river's shoals, to follow and catch and at last to reach inside him for what they'd lost, pulling everything out, which is how music entered the human world, a stain beneath the fingernails that tells where you've been. His head, his guitar floated down the Hebrus to the sea, where Apollo raised the strings into the night, making the turtle and the song immortal. That, anyway, is how it was put to me, in a juke joint in Mississippi, as if from Onomacritus to Ovid, to Ike Zimmerman, who taught Robert Johnson how to play, and when someone poisoned her, was it stabbed Johnson for something he said, like, "Won't you squeeze my lemon till the juice runs down my leg," or "I got a phonograph," back like a breath into the world, the water, the earth, the light. There is always someone there. Ovid should have said, to tear you apart when you get beautiful enough. First just picking at the skin, the fingernail or tortoise shell, plectrum a kind of tease, but then more strident. Your corona zipped off and flattened to a disc. This is how, in these moments, when music coaxes everything out of itself, when you become so attuned you almost hear the light, the pulse of the fluorescent tube over the bar, or the cigarette machine, or the star 900 years away, which is really two stars, eclipsing, then amplifying one another. This is how I imagine William Moore, after walking from Chattanooga to Gadsden with the sign, "Jesus was an alien," tapped to his caisson. His letter to Ross Barnett, "Be gracious and give more than is immediately demanded of you," still folded in its envelope when the assassin found him. And this is how I imagine Medgar Evers, not 2 months later, the pulse of the kitchen life reaching through the bullet hole in the window to flicker on his skin, the one struck down on the night of the year's first Lyrids, the meteors that seem to fall from the guitar in the sky, like change passerby have thrown through the sound hole. The other as the coins rang again on the dome of night. And Zimmerman in the graveyard where he taught Johnson how to listen, looking up through the trees and playing until the dew had fallen on him again, and he felt a music in his fingers he hadn't known for years. Maybe this is not what he meant. Ovid or an Onomacritus or Ike or whatever his name was, when he told me the story of the original bluesman, that night at the bar in Mississippi. But this is how I remember it. When I see him turning slowly in the neon as he reaches through the crowd, everyone reaching, gathering beneath the fingernails. This is what I remember when he leans his head back and I can see the beat of the artery in his neck. This is what I hear when I listen to the light pulsing on his skin. Thank you. Now, next up we have Epistrophy, read by Christopher Torockio.
Epistrophy. The sleeve sighs from the jacket, the record from the sleeve. The needle takes its breath. I know what's next, the horns, the hymns that spiral back to silence after the room fills with the sound of another room, the sound of steel as it fills the groove. Tonight it's monk's music, a record that begins in evening and then turns back to twilight. It pleads, abide with me, and then demurs, well, you needn't, as dark rewinds. Halfway back to crepuscule, it stops to ask for another hand, and I have to rise to turn the record as the room remembers the room it used to be. I have to raise the needle I couldn't touch, once too delicate for my hand, needle that had to wait for my father's. He'd stand some nights in silence, smoke his only word, then reach to take the arm. Or he'd stand and take a breath, sigh of the sleeve and the jacket, cough the door, and be gone. Like those movies, like those nightclub films where Monk stands from the piano, turns his quiet waltz, then walks off the stand, 20, 30 minutes gone, the sidemen keeping time while he works the night shift at the furnace. I have to wait for morning or evening again to hear the other side. Monk has to say in his child-red wagon while the stars spin through the pines. Now I turn the music back, turn it over, as light eases back into the sky. Dad wakes the blanket, the amp, the smell of solder, smell of oil instead of iron, twilight instead of twilight. Then the room is young again, the smoke, the silence, the stars, years away, until dusk raises its hands from the keys. Then the needle gasps, and I stand. I reach, his hand on mine, and breathe again. Natasha, Gambrell?
Postscript from Edgar Evans. I didn't want to write this, even to think of you. Afraid the thought would curl, would tangle, and make you common and factual as light. So I've waited, hands, pencils down. Now this seems a prayer against the world and being in it. That is why he waited in the bushes. That is a prayer, the closed eyes say. This is not the after image, but the image of day. On paper, it pours, new light, shows the edges, so nothing can be hid. Even if the words curl like hair, even if they curl like a vine. Again, today, the light is new, and because you are nowhere, you are everywhere. In the face of which I'd ask, how can I say anything? In the face of which I'd ask, how can I say nothing at all? The next poem is Mayflower, read by Jonathan Kirby.
Mayflower, for John Earl Reese, a 16-year-old shot by Klansmen through the window of a cafe in Mayflower, Texas, where he was dancing, October 22nd, 1955. Before the bird's song, you hear its quiet, which becomes part of the song and lives on after. Struck notes bright in silence, as the room's damp, wallpaper in wall muffling the high cicadas whine, mumbling talk from another room, hangs like the thought of a roof in the midst of rain, long after the joists have been brought down. So that the quiet syllables crowded, full throats once the talkers have gone away, and a young man's voice becomes a young man's silence, all he did not say, which nothing keeps saying in the empty room between the pines that hold the quiet of the song he cannot sing, the sound of a room without sound in the middle of what anyone can hear. The next poem is Letter Written on a Record Sleeve, and it's going to be read by Ben Blake.
I didn't know Jake, but reading his poetry, I sort of feel like I've known him all my life. When I came across this poem, I thought anybody who could work Thelonious Monk and Hank Williams Jr. into one poem is somebody I would like to get to know. Letter written on a record sleeve to Jason Moran. Pulled from the jacket, puckered, slipped from its lacquered disc. It's just a 12-inch square, an envelope waiting for something to hold. Just a blank piece of paper I've had since I was 12, and I slid Planet Rock from a bargain bin at the Gadsden Mall. Because of a name I couldn't say, dubbed, it was a $4 soundtrack to lying in the yard and waiting for the swift point of a satellite to scratch the drawn geometries and break free. Somewhere between the stars was a song I hadn't heard. Maybe waiting on a gold LP like Voyagers, to be spun somewhere past Jupiter, which we'd seen on TV, its color waiting folded in the dark for any passing eye. Afternoons, decades of hot light. Centuries had faded everything dull as the Hank Jr. tape stuck in my father's deck, so I'd dream it mumbling and static, past New Orleans or Houston. Coming in clearer after sundown, and maybe you were listening too, your hands ready for Monk's percussive touch, barrel house stomp forgotten and uttered as a new idea, fresh rhythm bouncing the ionosphere. The paper can make that sound, crack of dust beneath the stylus, and laid on the Steinway's low strings catch the hammer. Your beat hand makes, it rattles, a recording of the heart played back through a busted amp. A sock full of silver dollars dropped beside the bed. My mom said her grandfather kept them, one for each rocket, Mercury 3 to Apollo 10, and the flight he'd waited for, the broadcast he'd miss, man walking on the moon. Who'd cut farm forest from Hokoff to AM radio and color TV, how he watched the stars and waited, which is why they'd let me fall asleep in the yard. Maybe I can go back now, the dew just about to bead, moon to curl itself into those lenses, blades about to flower new constellations, in answer to the night, while the headphones pulse their binary and theremin sign. Maybe I can go back, while space tossed through the acres' old terraces, and I can lean down and change the tape to Blind Willie Johnson's Dark was the night, cold was the ground. Can unreal, it could rise from the earth, old language, or fall from the gold record spinning somewhere between the stars, where all the winds have gone to melody. And you, wherever you are tonight, reach into the dark and key the figure, the record sleeve, tucked in the bass clef strings. So the beat sounds like a memory of the heart played back at a distance, through static and years and wind. It reaches back like the future, which is just another kind of history, a shape for whatever's missing that fills its own outlines in. Okay, next up is Postscript written on a J card read by Stephanie Catucci.
Postscript written on a J card. Of course, my mother had two grandfathers who were both stories by the time I was born, memories passed like plates at holiday tables. Like my grandmother's recipes, you'd get the idea, but not the numbers. So one great-grandfather built the house where we'd gather, perfect plum, tornado strong, where I'd listen, trying to piece it all together. There, on the remnant of the farm, 12 broad acres of grass, and the few pecans' arthritic hands on the crest of the hill he cut from the forest, leaving 3 houses, his fields terraces, and a purse of silver dollars. The other one is also a shadow I see from behind, in vignettes of history, easy-chaired and turned toward a radio, a television, listening to, watching each space shot and telling my mom, I started out in a buggy, horse-drawn buckboard, and have seen the car, the plane, the rocket, how he wanted to see a man walk on the moon before he died. There are all these silver dollars, sometimes spread on the table after the plates are cleared and touched, broke mnemonics that summon one line of a story, but not another. The years remembering the cotton mills, the 3 wars, the gradual thinning of the stars. This was the town with the first electric streetlights, or so we were told. The town where the Army kept its first chemical weapons, so the memories are gases, or vapor lights switching on and off. And when this ravel of family is done, the dollars would be stacked and gathered again. Now I have this purse and its coins and bits of story that don't fit together. So I do the one thing the farm taught me and look away, into the stars, and try to shape the dots into myths. Poems are made, Levis said, by forgetting, the only kind of forgetting which is also a form of remembering. I lie down in the grass again. As the song fades out, there's a second or two of tape that sounds like someone talking into a pillow, conversation heard through a wall, which I'd figured was the TV bleeding, caught by the needle when I made my dub. It must continue, beneath the music, whatever show my dad was watching, and in years of looping the tape, I might have memorized the rhythm of Hee Haw, or Mork and Mindy, or Reagan one January night telling everyone, nothing ends here. Somewhere in the great ecliptic, the two grandfathers become one, the stars, the lines from one story wrapping with another's. So many people tangle there, their names, their stories becoming one another's. Spaceman, listener, grandfather, cousin, reach down and fill this case with stars. Up next is Exploded View, read by Angela Dilella.
All right. Exploded View. While he slept, I read my father's books, brought home from the furnace, traced the diagrams, channels, ladles of iron, oxygen lances, trying to follow the metal's path, to follow the work that took him each night into the dark, flamed the coals dark, the dark gone bright while the rest of us slept, the door closed like a storybook. While he worked, the furnace flamed in dream, and I tried to follow through the swarm of yellow jackets. Hot wings of iron, but they were just outlines in my dream, not iron, not fire in the dark, just spray from one rare story I tried to follow. But even he didn't want to go, not even in story, the blanks in the books, diagrams, all ash, all flame. All silence, they seem to say, but silence is a furnace, too, where work disappears, where breath is turned to iron, and night is a furnace, too. Where sleep, where dark are burned away, like words until the books are blank and there's nothing left to follow. I tried, listening as he eased the stairs, clicked the door, then drove away, his engine lost in the train's low drone. Strained to hear him turning, 10 miles away, pages in the book of iron, the story he told by not telling. The dark in which the furnace always rests, so the furnace is a father too, whose story you cannot follow. A shadow sitting loud in the dark, while the quiet hardens in his lungs. And the father is a story, too, you cannot follow, a book fed slowly to the fire, a fire worked at last to 2 black tongues of iron. Oh, next up is Letter to be Read by Furnace Light by Isabelle Palmer. Yep. Cool.
I am on the wrong street in the wrong part of town, following the chain of a poem in which the wrong music is on the radio in all the imagined rooms. And it isn't even a radio, but a record player. And the disc is Son Houston's House's 1941 session, and probably the label should look like the harp in the mouth of the Stella, or the welds of a locomotive's wheels, because this is the music of steel. Music you'd burn down mountains for. Music heated past any man's ability to see, to the bright of pure iron that will call your blood from your veins, your breath from your lungs. So the iron is blown stronger than ever. Steel you could roll, steel you could spin to a filament, a fiber brighter than pulpwood or cotton. This is the music of a body quoting back the machine and a body exceeding it. This is John Henry music. John Henry can't sing, so it's been handed down from the rail and the steam case and the coffin. This is the wake-up music which has walked me back to the Mississippi Gallery near the place where the dark birds gather in the lake edge oaks, birds the color of vinyl where Son House hears the train before it comes, before Lomax knows, before the microphone knows, and then it's the locomotive's music I'd hear each night before my father followed it to the furnace. Steel rails humming, the hot metal smell handed down like music from that place where everyone's blood is called by the same hungry fire. I am not going to say the furnace light falls on everyone the same, because we know when Andrew Jackson or John Coffey watches Tallahassee burn, it's the same fire, but not the same heat the Choctaw feel, and because this town, where Bunk Richardson swung from the railroad trellis, where Bill Moore was shot on his integration walk, the town where Miss Mary Hamilton insisted that the court call her by her last name, too, and this is the town split in two by the murder of a preacher by a Klansman and the murder of a storekeeper by a neighborhood teen, which is what I imagine my father and Red are talking about this one night as the heat runs out and the exhaust gas burns its ghostly blue over the furnace, dyeing everything deeper than the denim they wear against the fire, which they know may become the fire. And this is what they're working out, what my father repeats when he comes home, and I am still in bed. And this is how I take part in this music, turning around them as the record turns in the light of the quartz lock, and Son House puts his pulse into the strings and becomes a man with a guitar and a locomotive, too. And the iron rains to the hearth, and the steel is blown blind, and in a further room is rolled and drawn into these fine threads that hold the notes when the right hand touches them. So call it the wrong music, or the wrong room, or even the wrong part of town. But we know these geographies are melted and cast back again. Light and music, which is mine because it is ours, when the train passes by with its run-out pulse and the blue flame rises over the country, like the shirts we shoulder to keep the fire out, and the shirts we button to keep the fire in. And next up will be Feedback Loop, read by Jordan Thompson.
Feedback loop. The chair, the bedside table, the TV stand come out after she does, and then the bed, each thing leaving. Its weight in the box, as if you'd erase these letters, carefully leaving blanks, sharp as words, as if I could erase a voice from the cassette and listen to a quiet, open, and closed cupboard play below the cells, a memory of breath, earth beneath the door. Maybe ghosts don't want to come out. Wait, maybe ghosts don't want to come back. Maybe we keep saying these silences between our words, the shape of the words, and else, the warmth that haunts, the absent ones. Joanne Craggett, Postscript to Silence.
Postscript to silence. After the palm has clasped the hot, white iron, the pain whispers low. As the march of torches up the ridge, perverse lava flowing up. Pine knots flickers their shirts, their hoods, white as Asher. You hear the crackle, the whip, later on. Here lips part, but make no sound. Words separate slowly, having their distance to your ears. Moving like bees in a cry of amber. How old will you be when they arrive? When you remember the tissue your mother brought to her tears, watching the fire climb through the window. How white it was when you remember the sound of what you did not hear. That's when you'll feel the burn, when you'll feel the shape of those words, even the ones she could not say. Next is Amanda Perreault.
Letter written in someone else's hand to Natasha Trethaway from Atlanta. You see it first, the cut eye, tense lip, the craned body's English you read so well, the eye white's question for anything not white as bone. Once the napkins furl, once the wine is poured, you lean to ask, sly and quiet, did we just integrate this place? The tea lights laugh with us, antique shadow, antique flame, recalling before the arson, the cleansing fire, before the phoenix, cannon and tallow in the markets, fingers in the hair, on the gums, fingers held for the nails to be red, the moons, you tell us, once thought blood's tattoo. Now our hands are splayed, each phase, last, half, gibbous, clear as you reach and spin our histories out of us. You smile, the punchline quiet, my quarters waxing bright in your palm, and the candles and the table laugh again. Now the sepias, the tintypes my grandmother's grandmother walked out of, from the Cherokee Mountains into Alabama to wed a paler name, the dimes she spent on the town's fairest girls while her daughters worked the mill's second shift. My grandmother's, my mother's once long black hair, all seem at once so faint and still so clear. Later, I know, we'll stand outside and pass the joke again, washed together in streetlight and moonlight and headlamps and glare, as we pass into each other's stories. In evening's last embraces, we'll learn again the warmth of each other's blood. We'll feel it slip into the night, into the dark each pulsing graves, as we pull our fingers across each other's back against the grain. And next is Danielle Walker.
Okay. Abide. Forgive me if I forget, with the birdsong and the day's last glow folding into the hands of the trees. Forgive me the few syllables of autumn crickets, the year's last firefly winking like a penny in the shoulder's weed. If I forget the hour, if I forget the day, as the evening star pours out its whiskey over the gravel and the asphalt, I've walked for years alone. If I startle when you put your hand in mine, if I wonder how long your light has taken to reach me here. And up next we have Abigail Donaghy.
Because my grandmother made me the breakfast her mother made her, when I crack the eggs, pat the butter on the toast, and remember the bacon to cast iron, to fork, to plate, to tongue, my great-grandmother moves my hands to whisk, to spatula, to biscuit ring, and I move her hands too, making her mess, so the symbol of batter I'll find tomorrow beneath the fridge and the strew of salt and oil are all memorials, like the pan-fried kitchen that whistles in the grease in the voice of my best friend's grandmother, like a midnight mockingbird. And the smoke from the grill is the smell of my father coming home from the furnace, and the tang of vinegar and char is the smell of Birmingham, the smell of coming home, of history, redolent as the salt of black and white film when I unwrap the sandwich from the wax paper crackling like the cold grass along the Selma to Montgomery Road, like the foil that held Medgar's last meal, a square of tin that is just the ghost of that barbecue I can imagine to my tongue when I stand at the pit with my brother and think of all the hands and mouths and breaths of air that sharpened this flavor and handed it down to us. I feel all those hands inside my hands when it's time to spread the table linen or lift a coffin rail. And when the smoke billows from the pit, I think of my uncle. I think of my uncle rising, not falling, when I raised the buttermilk and cornmeal to the light before giving them to the skillet. And sometimes I say the recipe to the air, and sometimes I say his name or her name or her name, and sometimes I just set the table, because meals are memorials that teach us how to move. History moves in us as we raise our voices and then our glasses, and pour a little out for those who poured out everything for us. We pour them ourselves for them so they can eat again. And next is Danielle Donaghy.
Okay, just wanted to let everyone know if you wanted to get a copy. I know a lot of my students already have Abide. If you wanted a copy of any of Jake's other books, the bookstore is selling them, and you'll see them on your way out. You could pick those up. And could we just have another round of applause for tonight's readers? I think everyone did a wonderful job. I know Jake worked very hard on these poems, and I know they're not, upon first read, the easiest poems to enter, to find your way into, but everyone did such a great job, and thank you. And I know, I'm sure that Jake would be deeply satisfied with and thankful for the time that you put into preparing those poems. And thanks to all of you for being here to be part of this program and to celebrate Jake's remarkable poems and just the little glimpse you've gotten into Jake's remarkable poems and his remarkable life. I would like to end with a poem called Inscription for Air, which is one of the three poems in the book written for John Earl Reese. As John pointed out earlier, a 16-year-old high school student who, on October 22nd, 1955, was shot by a Klansman through the window as he was in a cafe dancing. At the time, the crime wasn't rigorously investigated. There was a suspicion by one of the attending sheriffs who said it was a black person from over in their neighborhood. That was as far as it went. A year or so later, I think it was 2 years later, no, I believe it was 1 year later and two men, it may be 2 years later, there were arrests made. Two men were arrested when one man confessed to shooting 9 times inside the cafe because there were young black people there and because he was upset that there was a new school for black students being built. And he was convicted of a crime, both men were convicted of a crime called murder without malice. Say that and not shiver. Murder without malice. They were sentenced to 5 years of a suspended sentence and never spent a day in jail. So the circumstances around John Earl Reese's death, unfortunately, are what we know about John Earl Reese. We don't know that there are any extant photographs. We don't know the day he was born. Therefore, we have to be approximating when we say that he's 16, the ballpark of that, or that's what he told other people who were around. So it can be so easy to get fixated when you come upon the tragedy of these stories and the weight of these stories, to stay only there, because people need to know these stories. They need to know those tragedies. They need to know that history. But as Jake reminded us in that intro, and as he reminds us throughout the book, if we are only looking back and thinking about a past in a stagnant way, if we are only emphasizing the tragedy of the silence, we are missing out on so much. And I love this poem because it reminds us, what he reminds us over and over and over throughout the book, is while we acknowledge and we remember and we share the stories of what has been lost, we can't focus on the death. We must remember the life. And as you listen to this poem, it's just brilliant. What do we know about John Earl Reese? Those 3 syllables, John Earl Reese, he refers to those in the poems. We know that he was born, and when he was born, like other babies, probably he was smacked. The doctor smacks you to make sure you can cry to clear out your lungs. We know probably that happened. And we know that he died. And we know that he danced. And that brilliant moment of empathy where Jake enters the poem, and he's speaking in this poem directly to John Earl Rees. So in the act of dreaming, as a reader, we are imagining that Jake is talking to John Earl Rees. And we allow ourselves to enter that as everyone in this room, but maybe just a couple people, have been 16. You've been to a dance. You've dreaded, oh no, someone's going to ask me to dance. Or maybe you said, I'd love to dance, but I don't want to get shot down. And you've done that, sticking your moment out, sticking your arm out in that moment, right? This could be lonely. And the magic when the person doesn't say no, and the magic when you enter a dance together, and the freedom that is, and all the nervousness and all that stuff. And and he imagines that this person dancing with John Earl Rees accepts his invitation as he puts out his hand and does something even more remarkable. What if she leaned close and whispered something sweet into his ear? What a beautiful, imagined moment that must have been. And imagine the sweat as he's out there dancing. Imagine the sweat starting right at the top of his forehead. So we don't focus on the death, which for so long is all we know about John Earl Rees. But we focus on the life. And let us end thinking about focusing on the life and carrying the lesson of history as a living thing to carry forward and celebrate beyond this evening. So again, thank you all to all the readers, and thank you all for listening. And this is Inscription for Air for John Earl Rees, shot while dancing in a cafe in Mayflower, Texas, October 22nd, 1955. Not for the wound, not for the bullet, powder's pale cowardice, but for you, for the 3 full syllables of your name we hold whole as a newborn by the feet. And so, for the cry, for the first note, the key of every word to follow, the timbre, the tone, the voice that could sing Nat King Cole's If I May and slow dance the flip side, the blossoms fallen like a verdict to the jury's lips, not to the blood or the broken glass or the spider's silking jukebox wires in a junk man's shed, but to the finger's heat still on the dime when it slides to the switch, the lamp on the platter, the groove that tells the needle what to say. And the pine boards of the cafe floor, once moved to the locust's moan, now warm as a guitar's wood, revived with all the prayers of song, amens that flame when a blues burns bright. Not for what is lost, but for what was lived, what is written here, in the night, in the vinyl, in the air. For the bead of sweat at the hair's decal, the evening star in the trees, soda pop sugar wild on your tongue, and for the tongue telling Saturday night something of Sunday morning, fluent as a mockingbird, and for the hand that opens as if in praise, as if in prayer, asking for another to fill it there, for the smile, and for the smile of skin behind the ear where love might lip its name. For you, if we may, pull back the arm and start this music once again. Thank you all again very much for coming.